Welcome to our special on the history of the nation of Cuba. In the last months of 1958, Fidel Castro and his forces have been battling the regime of Fulgencio Batista. By 1959, the Cuban 26th of July leaders were triumphantly entering Havana as Batista fled to the Dominican Republic. The revolution brings a feeling of euphoria as Cuba celebrates its victory over the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista. Castro and his nationalist movement take power in 1959. At first, the United States is not concerned over the change in power. They feel as if the new government would not affect their business interests in Cuba, including the sugar industry, Cuba's main source of income. Castro, the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, eventually steps into his new role as the leader of Cuba. Castro was very influenced by the nationalistic ideas of José Martí, and Castro realizes there is no hope for a sovereign Cuba without getting rid of the American influence. Castro's aggressive nationalistic policies begin to sour relationships between the island nation and the United States. Mainly his push to nationalize Cuba's sugar industry and utilities and bring land ownership away from the U.S. companies and back to the Cuban people. Cuban efforts to nationalize its own land threatens the United States' investments in Cuba. Cuba refuses to stand down against the threats from the United States. Any move back from their current policies and Cuba could lose traction in the revolutionary movement.
The Cubans begin to buy Soviet oil, to which the United States companies refused to refine. This led Cuba to nationalize all refineries on the island. The United States responded by withdrawing the sugar quota, and a month later the U.S. began its embargo of Cuba, which policies that still stand to this present day. Finally, Cuba responded by nationalizing all major firms, including textiles, banks, and utilities. As the United States became more and more aggressive against Cuba, Cuba found their only ally in that of the Soviet Union, the ideological enemy of the U.S.
The USSR took over the sugar quota that the U.S. had dropped and began supplying the nation with petroleum. As ties between Cuba and the USSR strengthened, what was left of ties between U.S. and Cuba withered away. Cuba would go on to adopt socialist ideology into their government in 1961. Finally, the failed U.S.-backed Cuban exiled attempt to cause an uprising at the Bay of Pigs invasion of April 1961 solidified Castro's leadership and was a triumph of Cuban nationalism.
It's in 1959, in an effort to strengthen the ideas of the revolution, that Castro founds the Cuban Institute of Cinematographic Art and Industry, the ICAIC. This body is tasked with keeping the spirit of the revolution through the use of films. The ICAIC wanted to sharply contrast that of Hollywood films and the American way of making movies and move towards more of a narrative of capturing reality. This comes from the 1950s amateur movement of film. Through the use of propaganda and realism, the films of the ICAIC represent a realistic view of Cuba with a strong nationalistic stance. The films are meant to show a progressive Cuba, sharply contrasting from pre-revolutionary Cuba. The film PM Cuba challenges this idea and went against the main rhetoric of the ICAIC, showing post-revolutionary Cuba in a less than positive stance. It's PM showing Cuba in a negative light that leads Castro to make his famous speech to the intellectuals in 1961.
The revolution must understand that reality and consequently must act in such a way that the entire sector of artists and intellectuals who are not genuinely revolutionary find a place to work and to create within the revolution, and so that their creative spirit will have an opportunity and freedom for expression within the revolution, even though they are not revolutionary writers or artists. This means that within the revolution, everything goes. Against the revolution, nothing. Nothing against the revolution, because the revolution has its rights also. And the first right of the revolution is the right to exist. And no one can stand against the right of the revolution to be and to exist. No one can rightfully claim a right against the revolution, since it takes in the interests of the people and signifies the interests of the entire nation. Within the revolution, everything. Against the revolution, no rights at all.
Fidel Castro's speech changed the way that Cuban filmmakers saw their craft. Freedom of speech became limited to pro-revolutionary thought. Through the famous line, "For the revolution, anything goes. Against the revolution, nothing goes." Castro states that freedom of expression and speech was important, but not more important than the ideas of the revolution. Through the ICAIC, the revolution would live on to the present day. The ICAIC would go on to make many films and is still currently producing films and is protecting the legacy of the revolution.